en este momento la asistencia de ciclo 3. Entonces, voy a explicarles básicamente el mecanismo para que lo tengan en cuenta y eso lo vamos a hacer todos los fines de semana. ¿Listo? Entonces, por favor, eso sí llenarlo porque pues se tendrá en cuenta la asistencia de ustedes cada fin de semana. ¿Listo? Entonces, les voy a enviar el link, ya les tengo que haber llegado a todos ustedes en este momento en el chat, por favor, me indican si ya les llegó el link.
Sí, sí, señora.
Sí,
Perfecto,
¿verdad?
me van a dar clic ahí, por favor, y básicamente les va a aparecer la siguiente pantalla. ¿Listo? Les va a aparecer esta pantalla. ¿Listo? La van a diligenciar, entonces hoy van a llenar la fechita del día de hoy, van a llenar, van a colocar su apellido, su nombre, el ciclo al cual pertenecen, en este caso sería ciclo 3, ¿listo? Y el documento que ustedes tengan. Entonces, si tienen tarjeta de identidad, si tienen cédula de ciudadanía, si tienen cédula de extranjería, la cédula de extranjería. Y siguiente a eso van a poner el número del documento de identidad. Van a colocar la sede a la cual pertenecen, ¿sí? Entonces, recuerden que los chicos que son de Cibate y de Soacha pertenecen al Instituto Francesco Petrarca, Kennedy y a Robert Hooke. Vos a hablar de Fusantec, Lijacá, Instituto Dante Alighieri, en Suba, el Centro Johann Kepler y Patio Bonito, el Colegio Mario Luis Rodríguez Cobos y Usme Tomás Moro. Si pertenecen a otro colegio, le ponen otro y ya. ¿Listo? Van a colocar su número de teléfono y el correo electrónico. Y por último, enviar la información. ¿Claro hasta ahí?
Sí, señora.
Mientras ustedes van diligenciando esto, yo los voy a poner un poquito en contexto. Hoy vamos a hablar un poquito de un señor muy importante que nos dejó un legado magnífico, donde trabajó e incursionó en el humanismo universalista, ¿sí? En donde, digamos que su principal objetivo era enseñarles, inculcarles a las personas, a las demás personas, sobre esa paz, esa no violencia, generar de pronto un cambio de conciencia dentro de la sociedad debido a los desastres, ¿cierto? A la violencia tan atroz que día por día, digamos que a nosotros nos ha llevado, ¿sí? Y que de cierta manera ha generado diversas situaciones en las cuales muchos de nosotros nos hemos visto involucrados de manera directa o indirecta, siendo víctimas de esta violencia, de esta guerra, que nos han quitado de pronto seres queridos, que de pronto nos han quitado tierras, ¿sí? Muchas situaciones en donde vemos todavía esa pobreza, en donde vemos que nosotros como tal aún no contamos con esa igualdad de condiciones, sino que por el contrario, aún seguimos en una sociedad donde la estratificación social es uno de esos tantos factores, ¿sí? En donde a veces la pobreza extrema se ve en algunos puntos del territorio colombiano. Entonces hoy vamos a tener la posibilidad de mirar minuciosamente cómo Mario Luis Rodríguez Cobos generó como ese llamado a la conciencia para que la gente, digamos que superara ese sufrimiento, esa tristeza que muchas veces a nosotros nos agobia, generando textos, ¿sí? De motivación personal, desde la parte psicológica o desde la parte política, religiosa, espiritual de cada uno de nosotros. Entonces, voy a enviarles a ustedes este pequeño video, pues para que también, si no lo alcanzamos a ver ahorita en la clase, lo podamos ver en casita, ¿listo? Entonces, por favor, tenerlo en cuenta, ¿listo? Entonces, regálenme unos minutos, yo les envío el link, pero también les voy a enviar Les voy a compartir entonces la pantalla. Bueno, entonces vamos a ver a Mario Luis Rodríguez Cobos, el sabio de los Andes. ¿Y por qué lo llamamos así? Porque pues digamos que todas sus comunicaciones o conversatorios que él tenía, lo hizo precisamente en este monte eh, de los Andes, en donde se reunía con multitud de gente de todos los sitios del mundo, ¿sí? Sin importar su color de piel, su cultura, sino que los acogió y les enseñó a ver la vida desde la otra perspectiva, como él la contextualizó dentro de su pensamiento. Entonces, por favor, muy atentos, vamos a estar allí escuchando. Y ya. Todos están escuchándome bien, ¿sí?
Sí, señora.
Listo, entonces, ¿es el sonido?
It's a violent social upheaval, a voice. In the midst of violent social upheaval, a voice ringing down from the mountains, a message of internal peace and the renunciation of violence.
La no discriminación y la no violencia.
Some hailed the rise of a new prophet, a healer. Others denounced him as a false messiah, a danger to youth, a threat to society.
The Ciclo movement became a movement that was seen as dangerous.
His followers persecuted, tortured, even killed.
The press did an incredible campaign saying that we were having drugs, we were having orgies, we were having I don't know which satanic practices.
His voice silenced, his words denounced and mocked. Yet somehow, this unpresupposing South American has touched lives all over the planet, from Mali to Montreal, from the poorest slums to the halls of power. Is it possible that this unknown sage really holds the key to an experience that could transform your life? He's a spiritual guide to millions of people all over the world. His ideas have given rise to movements and political parties. His social, literary, and spiritual writings have been published in dozens of languages. How is it that after all that, he remains the best-kept secret of the Andes? It's a story that began many years ago in a remote outpost high in the mountains near the border of Argentina and Chile. Today, thousands have traveled from the most distant points to join Ciclo not far from Aconcagua, the tallest mountain in the Americas. I'm here in the crowd, not only as a filmmaker, but also as one of many pilgrims from around the world who have traveled to this place where three great mountain chains converge. We have made our ways from Africa and the US, from every part of South America, from across Europe and Asia. All of this in response to Ciclo's message that our suffering and contradiction cause violence within us and around us, that creating internal unity ends that violence and produces the conditions for something new: peace, force, and joy. Imagine a spirituality that's not a religion, organizations of volunteers where no one is paid, including the leaders. An inspiration that for some has given birth to social action, for others political organization, and for many a spiritual path.
Hemos peregrinado a este paraje desolado buscando la fuerza que alimente nuestra vida, buscando alegría en el hacer, y buscando la paz mental necesaria para progresar en este mundo alterado y violento.
For some, all of this is very new. Others have come to join old friends and colleagues. My path to this place began when I was 20 and first came across Cilo's writings in a bookstore in Canada. Others have traveled farther and longer. The first time Ciclo spoke here, the rocky landscape was unadorned by buildings. Those who came did so at great personal risk. The first time, no one arrived in such style. The authorities were even less welcoming. The situation was more complicated and more dangerous. It may not be obvious in what a tourist might see today, but by the late 60s, Argentina was being torn apart by military dictatorship, right-wing hit squads, left-wing guerrillas, and everything in between. The cultural and political upheaval of that moment wasn't unique to South America. Riots and insurgency, revolution and protest were the reality from Malaysia to Ohio. In that overwrought environment, stories spread down from the mountain of an extraordinary young man. Drawn by curiosity or hope, guided by rumor or intuition, they sought him out, looking for a healer, a guru, or a guide. By 1969, Ciclo was living far from the centers of power in a small stone hermitage that he had constructed some miles from the outpost of Punta de Vacas. Even here, in the isolation of the mountains, the local military would often disturb his meditations by taking pot shots at him, just for fun. In the midst of the social and political turbulence, word of Ciclo continued to spread, and after persistent requests, he finally agreed to leave his mountain retreat and speak to a group of people in the city. Though permits were granted, the crowds were arrested before the events began. It was a pattern that repeated until it was finally announced that Ciclo was certainly free to speak if he wanted to speak to the rocks. He was told that he'd be welcome to return to his hermitage and speak to all the people who wanted to join him there. On May 4th, 1969, the same summer humans first walked on the moon, despite the fact that it was so far off the beaten track, despite the frigid weather, despite the heavily armed soldiers, a few hundred pilgrims made their way to this distant place to hear Ciclo speak publicly for the first time. His words must have surprised those who came to hear a Messiah or a healer.
A escuchar un hombre de quien se supone se transmite la sabiduría, has equivocado el camino, porque la sabiduría no se transmite por medio de libros ni de arengas. La sabiduría está en el fondo de tu conciencia como el amor, está en el fondo de tu corazón.
The talk that Ciclo gave that day lasted perhaps 20 minutes.
Desconocedor de las leyes que rigen el universo,
It focused on the nature of pain and suffering,
desconocedor de las leyes de la historia,
the varied forms of violence, the relation between the violence inside of us and the violence around us. At the heart of it was the tale of a traveler who had lost his way, a story of suffering and pleasure, of need and desire, and the possibility of a profound change. And somehow, despite all the difficulties, his message spread, by word of mouth, by flyers and posters, by every means imaginable, even as a comic book. Ciclo spoke here 30 years later, in 1999.
Aquí estamos de nuevo.
It was then that the stainless steel pillar was raised to commemorate his first talk. He spoke here again in 2004, and then in 2007. But over all that time, his message has remained unchanged.
Y bueno, y es la ciencia y es la justicia la que puede mejorar el dolor humano. Pero el sufrimiento humano es mental. Y el sufrimiento humano no se soluciona ni por el desarrollo de la ciencia, ni por el desarrollo de la justicia. Es un esfuerzo que tiene que hacer el ser humano para entrar en otras regiones de la mente. Ese es nuestro tema.
Learn to treat others in the way that you want to be treated. Learn to surpass pain and suffering in yourself, in those close to you, and in human society.
Harmless stuff. You might think so, but it provoked a ferocious attack from the press, religious leaders, and the dictatorship, from the right and the left, a wave of slander and misinformation that would lead to Siloists being attacked, jailed, and even murdered. The same pattern would later be repeated in Europe and North America, denounced by the media and ideologues from across the spectrum, accused both of being a cult and anti-religious, communists and fascists, members ostracized, meeting centers defaced, one in Paris was burnt down, and in the States another was bombed. In 2007, a major Cairo paper denounced Siloists as Zionists and dangerous outsiders. That short talk that irradiated from this mountain pass, heard by so few, provoked outrage and controversy. However, after all these years, surely we don't need to speculate. We can judge Silo's message by the fruits it's borne.
Learn to resist the violence that is within you and outside of you. Learn to recognize the signs of the sacred within you and around you.
It was a message that would be heard in the most distant points, transforming many lives, mine among them. But none of that would happen without real risks to some of us. Among her many accomplishments as Undersecretary of State in the Chilean government, Pia Figueroa was responsible for creation of that country's first national environmental legislation. This mother of two has followed a long path to this place.
I wanted to come here when I was 15, imagine, to hear Silo here on 1969, but I wasn't able.
Not long before, a young Pia had first heard about Silo.
Under the door of my house, it came a small leaflet, very small, I remember, with the image of Silo. It said, "My teachings are not for the successful, are for those ones that carry failure in their hearts." And I felt that that was what I had in my heart.
Where the choices for change seem to be self-absorption and drugs or armed struggle, Silo's call for nonviolent personal and social transformation touched some deeply, but went very much against the current of the times.
I remember once in my friend's house, she was having the guns hidden in, under her bed. I mean, that was the kind of options we were taking. Maybe if I would have taken the choice of a violent revolution, maybe my parents would have understood better.
Her father's reaction wasn't surprising, considering the baseless and vicious slander accusing Silo and the Siloists of every crime from rape to murder.
The Ciclo movement became a movement that was seen as dangerous.
Fíjate que esa violencia siempre deriva del deseo. Cuanto más violento sea un hombre, más...
We, of course, took our time to study our issues and went to retreats or out of town to take some days to think about. We were just meditating, but the press did an incredible campaign saying that we were having drugs, we were having orgies, we were having I don't know which satanic practices. It was totally unproportioned, totally monstrous.
They was beginning to say that they kidnapped children and took them to meetings And immediately they began suggesting that the meetings had sexual ideas.
My father, he wanted me back in home immediately. My sister followed also. She was smaller, 2 years younger than me, and he was desperate.
I am a lawyer. I did what I was taught should be done in that case. I went to the police. And she was found in one of the Ciclo's meetings.
The hysteria of the time meant that Pia's peaceful meditations were about to be harshly interrupted.
We were in a retreat one day, and an helicopter started flying, and they stopped there, all the police, and my father in the middle, saying, "We go home, girls, we are going home." And we were immediately bring to Santiago, and the judge started this trial, absurd trial, and we spent 5 days in jail.
Pia ended up in jail because her father feared that some strange cult was going to ruin his daughter's life. Subsequent events were going to prove him wrong.
I think that if people were like Pia, we would have a very nicer world. Definitely.
In this crowd are others who, like Pia, were around in those early days. Some suffered the same kind of social ostracism. Others were imprisoned or worse. Some stayed, and some, as exiles or by choice, left for Europe, Asia, and the States.
After jail and after that direct confrontation with my father, I decided that this message was enough important as to bring it to many other peoples in the world. So with some friends we organized and we went to Asia, and I lived in the Philippines for a couple of years. And we published the Ciclo's books, and we formed a lot of groups and a huge movement, where I met a couple of people, very nice friends of mine, Victor and Cherise, who later on moved to Canada.
And it was in that roundabout way that I first encountered Ciclo's message. I came across a sign posted by these two new Canadian immigrants. It referred to a dozen principles, tactics to creating a coherent life, principles of valid action. And then I found the book these principles were taken from, The Inner Look, a kind of poetic journey from non-meaning to meaning. The very first page lets you know what you're getting into.
Here it tells how the non-meaning of life is converted into meaning and fulfillment. Here is joy, love for humanity, for nature, for the spirit. Here the worldly is not placed in opposition to the eternal. Here it tells of the inner revelation, at which all arrive who carefully meditate in humble search.
To me, they seemed words that held great promise. But there were also things in that book that were hard to wrap my head around.
Ese es el librito que nosotros pasamos y le decimos a la gente, medite este librito, fíjese si en este librito están las cosas que a usted le resuenan como cosas importantes en su vida. Porque pronto va a salir el tema de, usted no va a estar aquí todo el tiempo, usted va a partir, todos vamos a partir, la vida se acaba en algún momento. ¿Cómo sigue esta película? ¿Es que usted termina para siempre? ¿O es que algo continúa en usted? Usted quisiera tener respuestas sobre eso antes de partir, porque partir es seguro que va a partir.
But why all this talk about death? It was difficult for me to understand why something lurking in the future should be a problem today. And no wonder. We've been trained to look only to our inheritance from the past for explanations of the present. It's a proven and powerful approach. Whether it's psychoanalysis trying to explain what we are by what happened to us in our infancy, or cosmology looking back at the Big Bang to understand what our universe is like today, we expect the past to hold all the answers.
Para todo, paz, fuerza y alegría.
But Ciclo turned it around, putting the emphasis on the future. Imagine someone with a difficult past who believes that tomorrow will be great. Compare them with someone with a wonderful past who believes that everything is falling apart. And for all of us, the future holds one certainty: it will end. And if meaning has to do with the future, what then? There's no meaning if everything ends in death. What do I have that can transcend death? My reputation, my children, the actions I put in motion, or... And it's these seemingly simple questions that Ciclo asks us to reflect on.
Do not let your life pass by without asking yourself, who am I? Do not let your life pass by without asking yourself, where am I going?
Entonces, lo pones en dos partes.
Sí.
Listo, chicos, ¿están ahí? ¿Me están escuchando?
Sí, señora.
Perfecto. Entonces, de tarea les va a quedar a ustedes, obviamente, terminar de ver el video de Mario Luis Rodríguez Cobos, en el cual obviamente van a sacar todos ustedes un pequeño resumen con respecto a lo que de allí pudieron percibir, ¿sí? Entonces vemos un poquito dentro de ese video cómo él se convierte en un líder, ¿cierto? Cómo fue atacado, obviamente, ustedes saben que cuando hay una ideologías o nacen ideologías, ¿cierto? Van a estar dos partes, una la que está de acuerdo y la otra que no, ¿sí? Igual cada uno de ustedes va a mirar minuciosamente, ¿sí? ¿Por qué fue tan importante este movimiento humanista y qué fue lo que lo hizo tan importante? ¿Y por qué aún prevalece y por qué se sigue hablando de esos ideales que tuvo Mario Luis Rodríguez Cobos? Dice entonces, para dentro de 8 días, ustedes me van a apuntar lo que más les impactó en un resumen, en una hojita. ¿Listo? Entonces, dentro de 8 días, empezamos a socializar por medio de la solución de la actividad que ustedes realizaron el día de hoy. ¿Les parece? Entonces, no siendo más, pues agradecerles. Apuntaron, ya tomaron el link del video. Ahí lo dejé en el chat para que todos lo tengan.
Sí, señora, gracias.
¿Listo? Feliz fin de semana. Cuídense mucho. Recuerden conectarse en ahorita a las 9:30. ¿Listo? Pregunta. ¿Todos realizaron el diligenciaron la hojita de asistencia?
Sí,
Bueno, si no la han diligenciado, yo se las vuelvo a enviar. ¿Listo? Entonces la voy a volver a enviar y ustedes en esos minuticos que les quedan, la diligencian. ¿Listo? ¿Les parece? Ahí se las dejo también en el chat. Muchachos, cuídense mucho. Feliz mañana. Un abracito. Nos vemos dentro de
sí,
8 días.
hasta luego.